Gospel reading today is from Luke 9, verses 28 through 36. Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent and in those days told no one of any of the things they had seen.
Let us be in the spirit of prayer. O Christ, the master carpenter, who at the wood and last secured humankind's full salvation, wield well thy tools in the workshops of our lives, so that as we come to thy bench rough-hewn, we may be fashioned into true beauty by thy hands. Amen. Well, this morning I would like to give voice to another character. Not a nice fisherman this time. And just the voice, not the props. So I want you to listen as Peter tells us his story. As he recounts an incident in his life with Jesus. I'll never forget that day. Neither will John or James. Just as we were turning in for the night, the teacher leaned over to us as the last embers of the campfire went out, and he whispered to us, "Meet me at the foot of the mountain at first light." There was a pink glow on the horizon when I saw James and John coming along the path. And together we crossed through the olive grove to where the trail led up into the hills. As always, Jesus was already there, ahead of us. Who knows for how long? Just as the sun broke over the highlands to the east of the Jordan River, we began our climb up the mountain. At least from the bottom, where when we started in that light, it looked like a mountain. Looking back on it, you might say, "Oh, that's just a little hill." But isn't that often the case when we look back on things in life? Anyway, it was just the 4 of us. It's kind of nice to get away from the rest of the crowd for a bit. Even though it's a great bunch of people, a great bunch of guys, it's nice to get away from them. It was just the 4 of us. And so we were there with Jesus, headed up the trail. I wasn't sure exactly where we were going or why we were going. It didn't look like anyone had a backpack, and nor did any of us were told to grab a small sack and to put a few crumbs of bread in it. Jesus often went away to pray, so we thought perhaps that's what he had in mind. I think that was what he might have been doing before we got there. I was just happy to be included. Just a week before that, Jesus had chastised me at some length because of an off-the-cuff comment that I had made without thinking. It's so typical of me. On we climbed, step after step. Sometimes the path was clear and smooth and not all that steep, but every once in a while rocks would impede the way and we would have to clamber over them or around them. Jesus set a brisk pace and didn't seem to be daunted by anything that blocked our way. When we reached the top, the teacher didn't seem to be breathing heavily at all, but I remember that how James and John and I had to lean against the tree just to catch our breath. I recall James even wheezing a little bit, but we're fishermen. We're not mountain climbers. We're used to using our arms, pulling in our nets more than our legs. We paused after we caught our breath and admired the view for a little bit. And then Jesus went off to one side. We assumed again that he was going there to pray. We knew enough to leave him alone when he did this, even though I had hoped perhaps get in a few questions while we had him pretty much to ourselves. Sometimes, I'll admit, sometimes I would take a nap while the teacher prayed. But for some reason, I decided to just be with him that day. Perhaps it was the exertion of the climb had awakened my senses. I wasn't about to doze off that day. Jesus was always giving so much for others. The least I could do was to offer my quiet companionship while he prayed for a bit. But let me tell you, I was not prepared for what I saw next. As I sat there and I watched, the teacher's body seemed to fill up with this light. It was like he was glowing from the inside out. The light grew until it seemed like his outer clothes were as brilliant white. They were brilliant white rather than their usual dusty, sweat-stained brown. I'd never seen anything like it. Such dazzling light, but that's not the end of it. All of a sudden, there he was. Now I'm talking about Moses now. That's right, the one and the only, Moses, in the flesh, or at least I suppose he was in the flesh at that time. And if that wasn't enough, suddenly there was Elijah the prophet, the lawgiver. Imagine that, the lawgiver and the prophet, both of them standing there talking with Jesus right there in front of us. How did I know it was them? I can't explain it, I just knew. So I began running around like I usually do, like a foolish me, and I kept saying, "This is big, James, this is really big, John. We've got to do something. We just got to do something." I know. I said to John, "John, let's start grabbing some rocks and we'll make 3 shrines. Right now, right here, in this spot, before it all passes, before any of this evaporates and disappears on us." So I reached down and I started picking up some stones that were there on the mountaintop and began stacking them. But I had no longer gotten those words out of my mouth when a cloud, not a dark storm cloud, but more of a misty cloud, a fog, nearly as brilliant as the light radiating from the teacher's garments, settled down over the mountain. This cloud, this luminous presence, or whatever it was, obscured all the trees, all the rocks. It obscured even James and John. And it was at that same time we all heard this voice, nondescript but with great authority. And it said, "This is my child, whom I love and in whom I am well pleased." And I'll never forget what it said next. Listen to him. Listen to him. Then, just as I feared, the moment had passed, the cloud of light lifted, Moses and Elijah disappeared, and the light within the teacher faded. Well, let me tell you, we were frightened, we were awestruck, we were amazed, and everything else all at once. I was as breathless as I was when I reached the top of the mountain. Dumbfounded and speechless, we just got in line and followed the teacher back down the mountain. It was on the way down that he said this oddest thing. He looked at us and he says, "I don't want you fellas to say anything about what just happened to anyone until the Son of Man had been raised from the dead. Do you understand?" Well, no, not exactly. We didn't understand. But we kept our word. That is, until right now. And I'm telling you, to the best of my ability, as an old fisherman can grasp such things, that is what happened. I've often read this story of the Transfiguration and wondered what it would have been like to have been there with Peter, James, and John? Wouldn't it have been something to have seen what happened there? Wouldn't it have been something to have been there, to have followed along that morning as they climbed the mountain? Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, and then to hear that voice from heaven. Imagine that. Wow. What a privilege that was. What an honor it must have been for Peter and James and John to be chosen to climb that mountain with Jesus. And if I could only, I've often thought, if I could only have such a faith-affirming experience, oh, how much stronger my faith would be. If I could only have been there on that mountain with them, it would cast away all my doubts. Oh, how I would believe. Now, before we go too far in that thinking, saying, oh, what a privilege it was for them, or how fortunate of them, remember, we have to remember this, that the ones chosen to climb the mountain were also the ones expected to join Jesus at his greatest moment of agony. In other words, if you want the glory of the mountain, be ready for Gethsemane. If you want to be with Jesus on the mountain, you need to be ready to spend time with him in the garden. And I'm not thinking about the one where the dew is on the roses. I'm thinking about the one where there was sweat like drops of blood. If you want to experience the lofty heights of the summit, you better be ready to bear the weight of a cross. The same spiritual path that took them to the site of the Transfiguration would also later on lead them to the site of agony and at Olive Grove. The three on the mountain were the three in the garden. In his life, Jesus prepared for both, and perhaps this mountaintop experience helped prepare him for the garden and ultimately for another hill and a cross. In the Christian life, it is much the same. We are called to be disciples, followers of Jesus, which means that we are to be his followers in all things and in all places. The highs and the lows, the easy and the difficult, the good and the bad, the pleasant and the unpleasant. For those of us who are or ever have been married, the call to discipleship is much like wedding vows. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, in the thick and the thin, on the mountains and in the valleys. But also remember this, that Jesus was with his disciples in both places. The three on the mountain were really four, and the three in the garden were also four. Jesus was and is never far away from his people. Never. I think the closing words of Matthew's gospel echo through the ages to us even today, where Jesus said to his disciples, "Surely I am with you always." Surely I am with you always. And that promise still stands. So let us take this message that's with us as we journey into Lent and beyond this into life. For as we know, there have been plenty and will be plenty of mountains and valleys to travel through and over and around in this life. The path is not always easy. Sometimes, many times, we are told we should take the narrower and more difficult way. This is what the teacher taught us. But we have a companion. We have a guide, a friend, who will always be there for us, who will always be praying for us, who will always be ready to give us a nudge when we grow weary, or a hand whenever we might stumble and slip along the way. So let us see if we cannot catch a glimpse of his glory for ourselves. But remember this, it is just as apt, or more apt, to be seen in the agony of a low point in our lives and not in the splendor of a mountaintop experience. Either way, either place, he will be there for you. You can count on it.